Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Okay, I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. I'm also Senior Vice President. I'm very grateful that you all would join us for our conversation about tackling the pandemic and situations of fragility, conflict, and violence. My friend Stephanie Hammond, who's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense at the U.S. Department of Defense, was going to join us for this conversation today, but she got called away late last night. And so I'm grateful to my friends, Frank and Jim, for agreeing to let us continue this conversation without Stephanie. So if you said, where's Stephanie? Stephanie got pulled away for because of a government commitment. And so we have to respect our friends in high level positions in government when these things happen. So I hope you'll all understand us and give us and be sympathetic to her ask to be excused and that we were going to go on without. But I think this is a really important conversation. Fragility, conflict, and violence pose critical development challenges. By 2030, up to 2/3 of the world's extreme poor will live in fragile and conflict-affected countries, threatening efforts to end extreme poverty and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. In recent years, we've seen more violent conflicts globally than at any time in the last 30 years, and 80 million people have been forcibly displaced by conflict and violence worldwide. FCV, as in fragility, conflict, and violence, FCV therefore has a significant destabilizing impact and takes an enormous toll on human capital, creating vicious cycles that reduce people's lifetime productivity, earnings, and socioeconomic mobility. Throw the gasoline on the fire of the COVID-19 crisis, which highly exacerbates all these challenges, causing significant health and economic harm to those living in FCV settings, threatening to further hinder stability and progress over the longer term. This conversation is going to help us address how the international community can support countries in their response to COVID-19 in fragile contexts, with a focus on, one, mitigating the impact of the pandemic on existing drivers of fragility and conflict. So think of COVID like throwing gasoline and lighting it on all of this hard stuff to begin with. Two, supporting the most vulnerable and strengthening resilience in hard-hit communities. And three, accelerating social and economic recovery post-pandemic. I'm really grateful that Frank Bousquette, who is the Senior Director of the World Bank's Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Group, is with us. He had led the new World Bank Group's first strategy, Fragility, Conflict, and Violence. I think it's a very important strategy, a really important report, frankly. And this is somebody with great experience in some of the toughest places in the world, has experience in the Democratic Republic of Congo, has worked in fragile states in Africa, worked in the Middle East and North Africa for the bank. The strategy is a must read and a very important product. We also have Jim Scheer, who's an adjunct political scientist at the RAND Corporation. Jim has also worked in some really tough places. Has twice served in the Department of Defense as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. He's also worked, as I said, at the United Nations. He's an accomplished scholar and has a number of affiliations in addition to his RAND Corporation affiliation, including he's at the Wilson Center, but he's been at every think tank. He's had research appointments at Harvard, the Institute of International Institute for Strategic Studies, Brookings, Stimson, Carnegie. The only place he hasn't been is CSIS. So Jim, we're going to have to fix that after this, because obviously you haven't been with us, but I mean, these are two really smart folks that are going to help us unpack this really thorny and complicated problem. My theory of the case, and then I'm going to turn it over to my friends, is that my theory of development is we've got 100 developing countries. About 60 of them are going to kind of sort of make it, in quotes. These are countries that are going to follow the path of Japan, Korea, even Kazakhstan. They're going to become middle income countries. They're going to become upper income countries. They're going to become democracies. They're going to hopefully, God willing, join the OECD, the club of free market democracies. That should be the goal, the end point. But we're going to be stuck with, I'm going to put that in quotes, we're stuck with for the next 30 to 50 years, about 40 countries. And I would argue that the future of global development and a lot of our security risks are going to be focused in these fragile, conflict and violence affected states, these 40 or so states. And these are really thorny places where you just can't use the straight up development playbook. You've got to think about security, politics, diplomacy, humanitarian issues. Anyways, these are really hard, thorny, complicated problems. So Frank, let me start with you. Could you talk a little bit about the strategy that you all published at the bank, why it's important, and some of the takeaways? You have this strategy for fragility, conflict, and violence 2020 to 2025. Let me turn the floor to you, and then I'll turn to Jim. Frank, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Dan. Now, this was a great introduction. I mean, we could stop there because your whole point about focusing on those countries for us is a top priority for the World Bank Group. Why? Well, our twin goal includes eradicating poverty. Guess what? Poverty in those countries, conflict-affected states, is actually increasing fast. In fact, our estimates, like you mentioned in your intro, Dan, you're completely right, is that by 2030, about 2/3 of the extreme poor will be in these countries. So when you talk about tackling poverty, better focus on those countries. That's one. Now, COVID-19, the elephant in the room, makes it even worse. Our latest estimates, we just published a report a month ago, is that an additional 18 to 30 million people, can you imagine 30, in fragile and conflict settings will be pushed into extreme poverty just this year. So the situation is not getting better, it's getting worse. If you look at 2017, we actually have seen the number of violent conflicts skyrocketing as it has never been since the past. If you look at forced displacement, refugee crisis, nothing has been worse today. 70 million people that are displaced, including 25 million refugees. Nothing has been worse since World War II. So basically the picture is the trend is not going in the right direction. And that's why for the bank, for development actors, we are scaling up. Scaling up, yes, it's about financing so that you don't actually provide tiny little projects, but actually you try to provide financing at the scale of the issue. For the next 3 years, an example, we are going to provide $25 billion in those countries. So it's a question of walking the talk. Are you putting the financing where the issue is, and are you scaling it up? But it's not about financing. Financing without a strategy, and I will come to your point, Dan, is not always effective. So strategy aims for us to recognize that working in those settings is not business as usual. And you rightly said that. It's about first recognizing that you cannot just focus on development. It has to be part of a bigger picture. So concrete example, it's about recognizing that at the end of the day, when you work in Central African Republic, our support needs to be in the supporting the bigger picture of the peace agreement between the government and different armed groups. And it means what? It means aligning our support with the peacekeeping work with the MINUSCA. Without the MINUSCA, forget it. We will be focusing in Bangui, in the capital, and we will not be focusing on what is the most important, which is what? Which is helping the government becoming more legitimate, becoming more present, becoming more accountable vis-a-vis citizens, so they are not being tempted by non-state actors, all extremist groups. And that is not a quick and espresso fix. This takes time. This is an issue. This gets worse before getting better. And that's exactly what the strategy of the bank is about. It's recognizing in terms of humility, don't do it alone. In those settings, partnership is a buzzword everywhere, but it's super important that partnership is with organizations with different mandates. And that people are not always understand it. It means partnering with organizations that we are not typically partnering with, humanitarian actors, security actors. So definitely that's one big push of the strategy, and we are actually walking the talk in the Sahel. I was mentioning the CAR in Sudan, in South Sudan, and I can provide later on some example. Second point about the strategy is to recognize that it's very important as well to have more staff on the ground with the right skill. You cannot just supervise from Washington, D.C. Twice per year what's going on in DRC. So we are putting more and more staff. Over the past 3 years, we increased our staffing by 150 bank staff on the ground. And guess what? Over the next 3 years, we'll do the same. Why? Because at the end of the day, it's recognizing that when you have low capacity, you better roll up your sleeve, not have a portfolio that is fragmenting, covering 20 sectors, but trying to see what is the most important. And the key focus of the strategy then is what? It's actually focusing on the key drivers of fragility, on the root cause of fragility. So what we did with this strategy, it's not just a Washingtonian documents. We actually consulted 37 countries that have faced those issues. And we took lessons learned about what works and where we have failed. And how can we systematize some approach that makes sense? So these whole notions of partnership with organizations that don't look like us. Second point, scaling up financing. Otherwise, there is a lot of discussion strategy at the top level, but it's not always effective. Third, it's about making sure that we are going to have the right staff with the right skill. We are making sure that all our staff now, it's a commitment, are fully trained. And it's not just for those who are interested, but it's obligatory. Train in what? Why do I need to partner on refugee crisis with UNHCR? How do I partner with the peacekeeping UNESCO in DRC? How do I design a project when I cannot implement it, when I don't have feet on the ground, leveraging ICT? There are so many techniques, so many issues that needs to be part of our DNA, and it's exactly what we step to. So let me just stop here on this, what is strategy about, and what also is so important at the time of COVID, because it's getting things even worse. Over to you, Dan.
I'm like in the amen corner over here, Frank. That's great, because I've been waiting like 10 years to hear what you just said. I'm so happy to hearing this from the bank. This is very reassuring. I also I want to come back. There's a series of things I want to ask you, but that's fabulous. It's very, very encouraging. Okay, Jim, you've been in every difficult place in the world as an academic, Department of Defense, UN. So what's your reaction when you hear this about what Frank just said? What do you think about the bank strategy? And then could you talk about how's the U.S. government, I'd say the bank since the 90s has been evolving on this. We've been kind of muddling, I'd say, in the United States since sort of the late 80s, since the first Bush administration. We've been kind of getting better and better at this, but we're still a work in progress. My colleague Errol Yaiboke published a commentary and on some of this. So what's your take on the bank strategy? And tell me about how is Team America handling this issue of fragility and stabilization? You're on mute. Is this like, it's like those game shows where, you have like Zoom bingo, like you're on mute, so you can put that in the X. So.
Thank you, Dan, for the intro. And Frank, thank you so much for your very inspiring description of the FCV strategy, which I fully endorse in terms of concept and in terms of intent. I think it's terrific that the World Bank group broadly is getting more involved in this, and you diagnosed the problem extremely well. Shifting to potential solutions, though, I have to confess it's going to be a very, very big challenge. I would start off by flagging, and I will speak mainly as a security sector expert here, but the multiplicity of hazards which we face in the fragile, conflict-affected world really challenges effective partnering, when we have to find ways around that to achieve the partnering, which is one of the key points in your strategy, actually, the systemization of partnerships across developmental, humanitarian, peace building, and security lines. But considering everything we're facing, both in terms of symptoms like displacement causes, the deeper problems there, it ranges from public service dysfunctions to climate change to poverty and hunger, organized crime, forced migration. The problem here, and we've seen this in the US government in particular, Dan, as I'm sure you know from the USAID background, each of these problem areas has its own constituency. You are bringing together individuals, institutions, offices with strong expertise, but siloed in a way. And that also goes to the issue of funding. Although I'm hopeful that with our Global Fragility Act in the U.S. context, we might be able to get around that. But it's a definite challenge when you just imagine an interagency meeting at the National Security Council, Dan, with everyone who has a stake in this. It would just be a huge room, and how to develop a coherent strategy out of that.
And that's just the U.S. government. That's not the UN. That's not the World Bank. That's not the Asian Development. It's just the U.S. interagency.
Right, right. The other thing which is affecting us, of course, is the immediate issue of COVID-19 and the impact there. And as a disaster manager disaster response manager for some time, I've in the parlance of that work, we talk about a hazard like COVID-19 as a compound hazard. You put it on top of all the other things currently going on.
I'm going with throwing gasoline on the problem and lighting it on fire.
Right, yeah. But I would also say, in addition to being compound, it's also a confounding hazard. I mean, if you think about the two key aspects of disaster response, you need mobility and you need access. You need mobility to get assistance into affected communities, or you need to move people to the assistance they need. And I have to say the mobility issue it's challenging. There has been progress in stepping up and getting PPE and masks and all those things that the World Food Program, which is the logistics base for a lot of this. And I'm delighted they got the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
But it's still going to be hugely significant. And there are going to be issues with mass evacuations in South Asia and during hurricane season and cyclones and typhoons. There's progress being made on how best to plan for this, but it's still a huge problem. And I would have to say, looking back at our Ebola experiences several years ago, there's some lessons there we have to be careful of. One is the problem of excess deaths. The fact that the total focus on Ebola in West Africa actually led to an increase in deaths in other areas where vaccinations were not being given as they should have been. And so that is a big problem. And also, COVID-19 is in some cases, many cases, it's much less lethal, but it's much more transmissible, asymptomatic transmission. After Ebola, there were these very impressive efforts made among African countries to monitor cross-continental traffic, mainly young men for work, and that was very important. But it's going to be much harder in this case to track movement and so forth. And I never thought I would hear about nursing homes and aircraft carriers grouped into the same bin as disease vectors, but there we were. So anyway, there's a lot to consider here, but I'm broadly supportive of the World Bank's effort. And I think the working on the partnership, developing the partnerships, I think is going to be absolutely vital. And so I look forward to further discussion on that. Thank you.
All right. So let me ask Jim, let me ask you a question. I got a whole series of questions for Frank, but tell me explain to our audience, what is the Global Fragility Act? What does it do? And so talk about that. And then I want to talk about Frank talked about the kind of having the right staff with the right skills. I want to talk about in the US context. I want to come back to that in the bank context, because I think this is a really important issue.
Sure.
But let's first, what is the Global Fragility Act and why is that important? Is it important, or is it just a symbolic thing, or is it how important is it?
Well, it's still being developed. I mean, the act exists. It was signed by President Trump and strongly supported in Congress. It is an effort to bring a unified U.S. approach to this fragility concern to conflict-affected areas. The State Department is in the lead, Conflict and Stabilization Operations Bureau in particular, but there are very well scripted relationships with DoD and USAID on this, which we hope will be sustained. The key is to focus on, to move into a piloting phase with, I believe, 5 key countries or regions that are the focal points for the initial pilot to develop a 10-year strategy for addressing the greatest fragility concerns that these countries and regions pose. I think a regional approach is very necessary in this case. It's been one of my strong themes over the years. We have to think regionally about these problems. And in the security area, where there's violent extremism as well as illicit criminal trafficking, and those two work together sometimes as what I'd call pernicious partners. The transit state problem is a particularly big challenge from the standpoint of corruption. And so you can't kind of miss that piece when you're looking broadly. And I'm hopeful that the GFA will inspire actors both at the strategic but also at the operational level. And by the way, workforce development and people in the field, staff in the field are extremely important here. And I think that'll be a very important element in the GFA as well.
All right, so let me try this out on you. I've heard some folks say, I'm going to use the US context, I'm going to come back to Frank on this, that we had 18 one-year strategies or 19 one-year strategies in Afghanistan because people did kind of one-year tours. I think General Petraeus at one point talked about having folks do really long stints in tough places. My friend and mentor, Andrew Natsios, who I think is one of the greatest thinkers and doers at the intersection of development, humanitarian response. He was also an Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel, retired, a civil affairs officer, has called for creating a special cadre of folks in the U.S. government who spend their entire career in these very difficult places. Something akin, I think, to say the Navy SEALs. The Navy SEALs has a 14-year period of service, and then they can retire after 14 years in the Navy SEALs. In the U.S. Foreign Service, it's 20 years. So in some ways, imagining doing 2 7-year tours of duty, let's say 7 years in South Sudan and 7 years in Haiti, and then you could retire. And you have to learn not French, but you got to learn Creole and whatever the language is in South Sudan. I don't know what the languages are in South Sudan, but it's probably not French and it's probably not English. So you have to learn a language that's not many people speak, and become trusted by, because of what Douglas North talks about in terms of the opposite of open access orders, whatever the closed access orders, I guess is what he talks about, or limited access orders, which is sort of his economic theory. Douglas North is, institutional economics about fragile states, that we need people who could be trusted by sort of in these complicated, really, and otherwise we're just it's like sending high school football players to the Star Wars bar and showing up and trying to figure out these super complicated places. So what's your response to having really long-term commitments and actually thinking about creating a special track with all sorts of incentives? When I've put this on the table to foreign service officers, they say, oh, I don't know, this is going to attract the quote unquote, the cargo pants set, right? The cargo pants set, meaning like ex-military people who my view is, and I'm going to be a little provocative, my view is we ought, in a country of 300 million people, we ought to be able to find 1,500 people, maybe ex-military, who go to development charm school, who do this. So Jim, what's your reaction then? I'm going to turn to you, Frank, about this, because I think we need something like this at the banks. So what do you think, Jim?
I'm very favorably inclined, Dan, and I appreciate your pushing this. expertise, language, cultural engagement is absolutely critical. I would say, thinking about colleagues in Foggy Bottom, we do need an offset here, and that would be to ensure that in a bureau like CSO or in the J world more generally in the State Department, we need to ensure there's also a good comparative knowledge base because staff experts who just spend all their time in one country over 7 or 8 years, as we've actually seen in some past cases, think of that's the solution to every other region in every other part of the world, and it's not. So you have to kind of balance the in-depth expertise issue on the one hand with a comparative knowledge base on the other. But broadly, I think you're absolutely right. We need to have experts, multidisciplinary experts that can work in extended time periods during these.
Okay, so I just Googled the languages of Sudan. It has its own wiki page because there's a lot of them. So in my mind, you need to speak Arabic. You probably need to speak Cushitic. That's a language. Chat, or brand. I mean, anyway, there's like a series of, there's a lot of languages. We need folks to speak not just Arabic if they go to Sudan, but perhaps a series of languages that are only spoken by, several 10 million people or 20 million people. And they ought to get rewarded for that. If somebody said, I'm going to go to Oklahoma State, we'll give you a full ride scholarship if you learn Arabic and one of these Cushitic dialects, and then we're going to send you to Juba or, Khartoum, or not Juba or Khartoum, to Frank's point earlier, but to some third tier city I can't find on a map right now. That'd be really important, don't you think, Jim?
Yes, absolutely. And maybe we could call it the T.E. Lawrence program or something to.
I love it. No, I think we got to come up with a different, I think we should call it, this is a bipartisan thing. We ought to call it like the Hillary Clinton, the John Kerry Pompeo Act or something, something like that, strategic languages program. But we need something like this. Okay, Frank, I had a laissez-passer. Okay, I was at the World Bank Group. I was at IFC. I was in the Bush administration. Then I went to the IFC. I was there for 4 years. I have a great respect. In Washington, we don't fully understand the power and importance of multilateral institutions. We don't understand the power and importance of the World Bank. You guys are sort of like the secular Vatican but with a lot of money and a lot of analytics. So the doing business is, I think, one of the most important things. We just did an event on this earlier this week. I feel very strongly about the doing business indicators. It had a hiccup. We need to protect the doing business indicators. So some of what you all do is research. Some of what you all do is money, and some of what all you do is advice. So I'm very happy to hear that you're talking about right staff, right skills, more people over there. Now, so no offense, right? So I love the World Bank. I've been a big supporter of the World Bank. I was a supporter of a capital increase for the World Bank and helped the Trump administration come up with their negotiating position for the capital increase. I will be supportive of the next IDA increase, which is the fund for poor countries, which includes mainly FCV countries. And I understand that in IDA, reading your strategy, there's some discussion about there's going to be a special fund for these tough, thorny countries. So I'm in favor of all that. But when I think about my friends at the bank, and I'm coming from a place of love here, a lot of them, their idea of a good time was staying in Bethesda, being a member of the Bretton Woods Country Club. They were going to that's how you moved up the system. You went from F to G to H to I, which are the rankings at the bank, which is like becoming like, a captain, a major, a colonel, lieutenant colonel, 1-star general in the bank system. You could do that staying in Bethesda, staying at the MC, staying at the main complex, staying in Washington. So how are you going to get folks, and the kind of folks that have been hired are folks whose idea of a good time is doing kind of macro analytic work in Brazil or macro analytic work in India, as opposed to saying, I speak some Chadic dialect, working and not working in Juba, but working in these places that they're talking about. So I'm all for it, but that is going to require a revolution, in quotes, in how you incentivize people at the bank, who you hire at the bank, the kind of instruments you have at the bank, and the culture at the bank. And I think it's a very important organization. I've always been supportive of it. And you're just going to have to think about and you talk about this in the strategy. So what you've put forward is very bold in that strategy. So do you have the support of your management? Do you have the support of the board of governors in this? Because this is going to be you're going to get all sorts of passive aggressive pushback from the system. They're not going to like this. They want to do macroeconomic studies in Brazil and India. That's their idea of a good time. Unless you say you're not going to get to G or not to become H unless you do this and go to Juba. So what's your response to that?
My response to that, Dan, is that the bank is changing. And I think that's good. I think you're right. You put the accent on the key issue. If you don't put the right incentive, why people will do it? It's actually less safe. It's actually not always easy. You are really dealing with low capacity environment, corruption. So basically, obviously, you need to ensure that people understand what is the priority of the bank. So let me be very straightforward with you. Yesterday, I was just invited for an onboarding of new staff, all the young professionals that arrive at the bank. And my point was very clear. Say, listen, if you plan to join the bank and not work in countries impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence, then you should go to other consulting firm and other organization, because that's the place to be. It's focusing on those countries where poverty is increasing big time. Otherwise, we will not succeed on the twin goal. And I can tell you then that the feedback is actually positive. Why? Because it's not only me. It's actually, more importantly, our president, our board, all the senior management of the bank that is fully owning the strategy and putting the focus on you need to go on the ground, otherwise forget about your career. And I think it's extremely important. So what does it mean? It's not only the strategy, as I said. My point is that we already have 800 staff on the ground in fragile states, okay? Which is, look at many other organizations, we are not necessarily always there. We are going to have an additional 150 staff on the ground. And like you rightly said, it's not only in DRC and Kinshasa, it's actually having staff in Goma. Because guess what? Between the North Kivu and what's happening in Goma next to Rwanda and in Kinshasa, the situation is completely different. So you need to have the granularity needed to really understand what's going on. Jim was mentioning Ebola. Yes, excellent example. If you deal with Ebola, it's not only about the health response, it's actually about the community resilience and how population in North Kivu are going to see government intervention. If you're not on the ground to understand the dynamics, forget about being effective. And that's why for us, it's really what is in the strategy. It's not only about the talk, it's not only about the principle. What we did is that we have actually looked at, again, all the lessons learned over the past decades. The bank was created after the Second World War. My country was the first country benefiting from the loan for reconstructions. And we have progressively over the past decades moved from focus on reconstructions to a focus on working during crisis, which before was seen more as for security actors, working in refugee crisis, because those refugee crises, they are actually protracted crises. Refugees stays for 5, 6, 7 years in hosting countries. And it's not only about providing blanket, water, and support, it's actually providing support to the hosting communities for health, for hospitals, for schools, and so on. So we are really changing, working across the spectrum. The last point is about prevention. As you mentioned, Dan, as part of our recent IDA 19, $25 billion for the next 3 years in those countries, we already put a specific allocation on prevention. What is it about? It's about, for the first time, providing support for government to focus on tackling grievances from people in some lagging regions that have not seen the states, for women, for dealing with some conflict in some particular area, so that it does not escalate and becomes a security humanitarian issue and then it's way too late. The international community has realized, we released a report 2-3 years ago with the UN, by the way, showing that $1 invested in prevention is yielding about $16 in terms of return. This is significant. And it's not only, again, a humanitarian security issue, it's first a development issue. So what does it mean? It means that we are providing support to Burkina Faso, Niger, looking at Chad, looking at Mozambique, discussing with government, involving the UN partner, so that we can see where is the peace agreement, what is your big picture item in terms of security in the countries, and how we can, through the development perspective, help you to implement this peace agreement. This is new, and like Jim said, it's super challenging, and we need to manage expectation. This is not going to be achieved in 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years.
This is a 20-year,
it's not only a question of financing. It's only
a generational challenge.
Completely, but at least it needs to be tackled with humility and recognizing that if you don't partner with other organizations, if you are not looking on the ground about what are the root cause of fragility, you are not going to be able to have the effectiveness that you need. So for instance, another concrete example, across all those countries, what we produce are risk resilient assessment. So what is it? It's maybe a bank jargon, but what is it? It's actually showing about before we engage, before we put off financing, what are the root cause of fragility? It's about corruption, it's about governance, it's about lack of capacity, it's about security, so that we have a better understanding about where can we, with our comparative advantage, focus on. And that's something which is important because it prevents us from just putting more financing on national institutions where you could have sometimes a risk of exacerbating drivers of violence. So again, it's not going to be easy, but that's what we try to do. On staffing, Dan, just on that point, if I may, so not only it's changing, the senior management of the bank is very supportive. We are putting more and more staff on the ground, but also we are providing the training. Training is super important because if you just put the message from the top, that's fine. But at the end of the day, this is not sustainable. So what we do is that before colleagues goes on the ground, they receive training. Now we do it virtually. We had to readapt completely about how do I design a transport operation in the Sahel? What does it mean to work with the peacekeeping? Why do we need to work with UNHCR on refugee agenda? Otherwise, forget about it. What does it mean to supervise when you don't have the feet on the ground leveraging GPS? So, and by the way, we're inviting bilateral partners that are quite interesting to join because for them, it's also a way to enhance the cooperation. So the bank is really changing in terms of the staffing. And also, last but not least, as part of the evaluation of staff for their career, for their performance, we are looking also at the presence of those colleagues that are working in the most difficult country. So all that is, I think, is going to be making an impact.
Frank, this is very encouraging. I encourage people to read your strategy that you came out with. The fact that they named you a senior director, that's a big job in the bank system. That's a strong signal to the bureaucracy that this is important. So I'm encouraged by those two things. But when I was at the bank group, more 10 years ago now, if I talked about used the term security actors, people would have freaked out. So if I use the fact that you even use the term security actors is a big step forward. So could you just press you a little bit more on this issue? If I say the word security actors and the World Bank, what's your reaction to that, Frank?
Security represents in many of those countries 20, 30, 40% of the budget. And what we have done is a different level. One is we have conducted some public expenditure review of security sectors. Again, we do it from our development and comparative advantage, which is the development actors, looking at PFM, public financial management, pension plan. So it's not about advising at a granular level, which will be out of our competency and which will be out of our mandate, but it's more from a development perspective. How can we make sure that the funds are actually allocated where it should be? And would it be an opportunity to save some funds that would be allocated to health, education, like Jim mentioned? So that's one. Secondly, security, it means that without security in this country, there is no development. So if you're not working, as I mentioned, with MONUSCO in DRC or MINUSCA in CER or the UN peacekeeping, you're not going to be able to move outside the capital city. And guess what? The legitimacy of the states, the accountability of the states, it's precisely outside. It's very often reaching out to those regions that are out of reach. So unless you work with security actors, you're not going to be able to provide development support. It's also about working with humanitarian actors with whom we are not working. In South Sudan, we work with ICRC, the Red Cross, which is doing a fantastic job, not only in terms of being able to move in areas that are out of reach for us, but also to provide the right intelligence and the right information at the local level because they have the proximity to the most marginalized groups. And I could mention many other examples on the security sector. For instance, in Somalia, we are partnering with UNSOM to assist the government in evaluating the fiscal sustainability of its security sector and the strengths of its public financial management system. And we have done the same in Gambia, in CR, in Mali. So yes, we look at it, not at all from a security actors. We are not changing our mandate. We are actually leveraging our mandate as development actors to be more effective on the ground on those issues that are the most important.
Jim, can I bring you into this? You were at the Department of Defense. You were in the UN system. You're a serious academic looking at these really hard, thorny issues. What's your reaction to what Frank just said about, this sounds different to me than say where the bank was 10 or 15 years ago. Is that your reaction?
Yes, but in a very positive way. I think he's moving exactly right, and I appreciate the challenge in adroitly navigating concerns about the quote militarization of an approach. I've seen that as well. But one thing where my former department, I think, would be, and the service members, especially in the working on the irregular indirect side to include civil affairs officers, the first thing they would say in response to your comment is, you're right, we have to get outside the capital city. If you go to, Kinshasa, Mogadishu, Kabul, anywhere like this, you're not understanding the full dynamics of the country. If you have to go to the borders, you have to go to rural areas, you have to understand how to navigate adroitly, and that is very critical. So I'd give that a big shout out in a positive sense. The one thing I would raise, though, and I think you're probably addressing this in your rigorous analytical approach, your assessment and resiliency effort, is are you looking hard at the potential, what I would call perturbation impacts of the assistance? We want to have intended effects as opposed to unintended effects. And in the security sector, we have sometimes seen a problem of what I would call the winners and losers problem, where we provide security assistance to, say, elite forces.
You give money to this province that's dominated by the Baltimore Orioles, and this province over here is dominated by the New York Yankees, and you're giving too much money to the Baltimore Orioles opposed to the New York Yankees, and it creates a disturbance within the country, right?
Absolutely, and there's always been state fragility between Baltimore and New York. Yes, there is a potential issue that there's always a challenge in understanding exactly how the recipient will react. So I just wanted to see if Frank, is that on your agenda?
Now, big time. I mean, that's precisely what we do, those risk resilient assessment. Maybe I should have said a little bit more. It's not only to look at what are the key drivers of fragility, but it's to bring this political economy analysis to ensure that actually through development aid, you are not going to exacerbate existing drivers of fragility. So this is what our documents are. And it brings different skills. I mean, my group have 50 staff, many colleagues that are on the ground to actually discuss with local NGO, discuss with counterpart, civil society, to better understand the dynamic and where we should be very careful in terms of moving forward with financing. So those documents are now becoming mandatory in any countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. We need, before engaging what we call country partnership framework, which basically is our engagement with the country and our financing, we need to have those assessments that really shows again where we need to be careful, where we need to focus, how we can be the most effective, and also providing some guidance on operation. So we are moving, it's not only a political economy analysis or looking at the drivers of fragility, but it's the, and so what? What does that mean? Do we want to have a portfolio that is going to be covering 20 sectors? No, we may want to focus on the PFM for Somalia, on the budget in Afghanistan, on governance issue. In these other countries, we may want to look at the security sectors. In the third country, we may want to focus big time on education and so on. So selectivity, it's also a point I wanted to mention, is super important. We have seen that in the past, sometimes portfolio of the international community and the bank was sometimes a little bit fragmented in those countries. Things are changing in a way that we are becoming more selective, because in front of you, you have actually government capacity quite low, and therefore they cannot afford to have donors coming with so many priorities. So for us, those documents of assessment, yes, they are looking at key root cause of fragility, but also providing a political economy analysis to avoid the risk that you just mentioned, Jim.
So Frank, let me just briefly, so IDA is the fund for the poorest countries. Every 3 years, the bank group passes the hat for the wealthiest member states shareholders to put money in for soft loan grants for IDA. Over time, the number of IDA countries has been shrinking, and there's over the next couple of years, it's going to shrink more. I'm guessing that, I don't know how many countries are IDA eligible now, 40, 50, or 60, something like that. The overlap, the shrinking number and the overlap with FCV, I'm guessing of the 40, 50, or 60 IDA countries, I'm guessing 40 are FCV affected. I don't know if, am I right? Is that about right?
Yes, about 37. So and we changed the list, but actually, Dan, good point, if I may. This is not only a strategy for those, what we call conflict affected situation. Fragility goes also for middle income countries. So we are also supporting Philippines in Mindanao. We are supporting countries like Colombia impacted by the Venezuelan crisis. The whole point and by the way, the number of violent conflicts worldwide has significantly increased where?
Or Guatemala.
Middle income countries. So for us, very important to see this strategy. Yes, we have IDA, Fund for the Poorest, on those countries, like I mentioned, Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, Haiti, CAR, the Sahel, DRC, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan. But it's also actually leveraging our funds, IBRD, to try to see how we can support countries that are middle income and that have pocket of fragility. And that also, I would like to make sure that we understand it's IDA, super important vehicle, with a new way of providing financing for issues that were not necessarily tackled. Refugee crisis, we have a window of 2.5 billion. Support to the private sector with IFC and MIGA. This is a World Bank Group strategy, extremely important. Job in those countries, this is not about growth, this is about stability. So there is, but also it goes beyond. We set up, for instance, what we call a global concessional financing facility with the support from the US a few years ago, which was supporting Jordan and Lebanon impacted by the Syrian crisis, which countries are opening their borders, providing a global public good, and needs to be receiving funds at a concessional level so that they don't run into
so Jordan hosts Syrian refugees. They get a cut rate deal on loans from the World Bank because they're taking on this global burden of handling and receiving all these refugees from Syria, right?
It's exactly, and now we have extended because we recognize it's not only about Syrian crisis to Jordan, Lebanon. This is also about Venezuelan crisis impacted who? Ecuador, Colombia, and so
Brazil.
On. So this is also again
awesome.
Looking at all of financing instruments. IDA is the major one, but also recognizing fragility is also in middle income countries.
All right, I got questions from the audience. I love this. This is great. Okay. So here's a question for Frank, question for Jim. Okay, Frank, this is the question for you. Under the new FCD strategy and the growth of resources for the bank support to fragile and conflict-affected states, how are decisions going to be made on how financing is dispersed and deployed in FCD context to optimize its impact, particularly through the new IDA 19 replenishment? This is what you talked about. Will new financing instruments be used? Longer project timelines? Co-financing new partners? So that's Frank's question. So Jim's question is, Jim, why not incentivize former Peace Corps to become part of this Fragile Corps? I like this idea. So what's your take, Jim? And also the State Department needs to go back to supporting regional specialists who speak regional dialects, who understand transboundary ethnic contributions to fragility. I like this. So Jim, that's your react to that. Frank, you react to that. Let me start with you, Jim. What's your take on sort of these questions on Peace Corps and State Department? And Frank, I'll turn to you in a second. Jim.
Thanks, Jen. I think that's a very interesting idea that deserves further exploration. I know that some former colleagues in USAID have cycled through Peace Corps management duties, as well as having been Peace Corps volunteers very earlier on in their careers. So that might well be a very good way. There may be other occupational activities, communities that can be drawn from, but yes, I would very much support that.
Okay, what about the state question?
About this, the State Department in terms of the language?
Yeah, regional specialists. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I've lived through various dialogues with the State Department on regional expertise, and I can appreciate some issues, especially at the Foreign Service Institute and the education and training piece of that. But I think if we look hard at regional language and expertise, I think that's a critical element. So I would support that too.
I think we ought to be given full ride to farm kids in Nebraska. If you learn French Creole for Haiti and you commit to doing 7 years in Haiti, we ought to pay for Oklahoma State or Nebraska State. We will give you like a Navy ROTC, like a military scholarship if you do 7 years in Haiti, I will give you a full ride 4-year undergrad degree.
Right.
Let me just say one other thing and then I'll turn to Frank. I was an architect of something called Prosper Africa, which is the Trump administration's kind of approach to Africa, which tries to see Africa as a win-win business opportunity. And it builds on starting from the Clinton administration, Bush 43, Obama administration. So the arc of evolution towards how we think about Africa as a partner, not just as a country to, continent to save, if you will, and see it as a win-win partnership. One of the things I suggested, I've been pushing is we have 2,500 Peace Corps volunteers in Africa at any one time. I would like to give each Peace Corps volunteer, if we could get 10% or 20% of every Peace Corps person serving in Africa, a 5-year visa in their country, now that they've learned Wolof or Amharic or some other African language, or Portuguese or French. Give them a $50,000 loan, a 30-day crash course MBA, and a 5-year visa. They ought to go and make their fortune in Africa. We need to have thousands of Americans make their fortune in Africa and see Africa as an opportunity. So to this person's point about using the Peace Corps, there's 200,000 former Peace Corps volunteers. And at any pre-COVID, we had about 7,000 or so Peace Corps volunteers around the world at any one time. I think this person's right. We ought to figure out, in addition to my idea of encouraging people to start a business in Africa, we ought to say, hey, have you thought about the Fragility Corps? Or have you thought about working for Frank Bousquette at the World Bank? Because he's looking for folks who speak Amharic. And maybe you could stay in the field and be hired as a field hire at the bank or the African Development Bank. So anyways, I think this is interesting stuff. Okay, so Frank, the question to you, what's your take?
So financing of IDA. So IDA as a whole, provide support, as you said, Dan. I think you cover everything in your introduction. Support to the poorest countries, about 74 countries. Now, to be eligible for those funds, the countries, of course, needs to be having a certain ratio of relative poverty, which is defined as the GNI per capita below $1,200. I will not go into the detail. And the way that we allocate funds is also looking at the performance at the country level, which is to say how countries are truly looking at the implementation of policy, promoting economic growth and poverty reduction. So the allocation of IDA funds are following basically this key principle. Now, in addition, if I zoom in on those countries, which is the topic of our discussion today, that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence, we have also some specific window and specific envelope. Why? Because we believe that the challenges are so specific that it's important to tailor the financing to the specific situation. What am I talking about? I'm talking about, for instance, addressing refugee crisis. What we are doing today used to be seen as a humanitarian issue 10 years ago, with less focus from development partners. What has changed? Over the past 3 years, we have supported about 14 countries hosting refugees. Let's not forget that 80% of refugees are in developing countries, by the way. And we are supporting them because they provide a global public good, because they open their borders. Supporting doing what? Not doing humanitarian support. That's not our role. This would be overlapping mandate. That's no sense. It's about working with UNHCR by supporting refugee and hosting communities to make sure that you mitigate the tension. And second point, it's making sure, because it's a protracted crisis, this is not solved in 1, 2, 3 years with humanitarian support, making sure that the hosting countries have truly the system that is able to provide health support, water support, and so on. So this is a concrete example, and I gave you numbers: $1.8 billion over the past 3 years in 14 countries through 35 operations. Moving forward, IDA 19, we have more than $2.2 billion dedicated to this refugee window. And we decided to have those specific window because, again, it's not just providing funding to the country, it's assessing the refugee policy framework of the country hosting refugee. Because the whole point of the bank, this is the bank of all the different countries, is how can we leverage our support? It's not only about financing $1.8 billion of operation. Of course, it's important, but it's also being able to move the needle and helping the countries do more and receiving support from all our partner countries. Look at Ethiopia, where we support the government who did a fantastic job in terms of passing the Proclamation Act for welcoming refugees. So what we're trying to do is to work not only in funding projects, concrete projects, offering job, water, health, education to refugee and hosting communities, but also working with our partner. And that's why partnership is important. UNHCR, to help supporting the government in the implementation of the Proclamation Act, which is as important, if even not more important. And I could mention that we have, just to finish, different allocation on prevention. I talk about it, so important. Why are we just put this allocation and don't put it in the classic performance-based allocation at the country level? Because we believe that before putting funding on prevention, you need to have some discussion about the government action plan, to look at the positioning of security actors and what are the other challenges that are going to be impacted by this support. So we have a number of envelopes. I don't want to be too lengthy today, but why? It's because we need to make sure that financing has the right incentive to change and making sure that our support is fully aligned with the bigger picture and the challenge of those countries.
Okay, so question for both of you. Can you talk more about country government and civil society roles in enhancing resilience? So responding to COVID, and so government and civil society enhancing resilience. Jim?
Well, from the security sector standpoint, the biggest thing to me is, how do civil society groups, how do local communities view their security practitioners? If they see a group of armed individuals running through their village, are they protecting me or are they predators? And so there's definitely an imperative for institutional reform and capacity building. If we had another hour, I could go into that in some detail, but the key issue is to build local buy-in and support for legitimate security actors. One thing I have pressed hard on, which I think is quite relevant in our current post-COVID world, is civil works taking on giving the military actually some role in helping develop, to work on development. That there are some public-private partnership issues there, of course, that have to be considered, but Senegal and parts of rural Liberia, for example, have, I think, benefited from civil works investments, and that may be something which can help local communities, especially if the road that I could not pass along now before is now passable with help from engineers. So that's just one of many things that where on the security actors can make a positive difference if they are managed in the right way and have good ties to the local community.
Frank?
I mean, 2 points. I fully agree, actually, on the point that Jim mentioned. Looking at local grievances, looking at the dynamic at the local level. As I said, this is not looking at from Washington eyes. It's not looking even from Kinshasa eyes. It's actually looking at Goma, what's happening. So what does it mean? It means that if you are not partnering with local actors, and guess what? It's also about local CSO, it's about the Red Cross, it's about humanitarian actors. You are not going to be able to appreciate where the funding will be the most effective. So yes, if you look at our strategy, it's not only about addressing drivers of fragility, but it's about building resilience and partnering with those actors that are going to be able to achieve this. Resilience is key. I mean, we always talk about what are the key issues, key root cause of fragility. We sometimes forget that those countries, they have a number of features that help them to be resilient. If you look about how they have managed previous crises, if you look about all the natural resource, if you look at, there are so many aspects that we need to build on in a very important manner. So resilience is important. It's part of what we call building back better after COVID-19. It's making sure that they will have the right health system so that when the next health pandemic hit, and there may be one, they will be better prepared than today. So when we are supporting, and we, by the way, supported 31 fragile affected countries since February on COVID-19, 31 with more than $2.5 billion, we always focus on strengthening the health system, not to build parallel system. So this is very important, not only to provide the PPE and all the support needed today, but it's also to prepare the system to be more resilient tomorrow.
Folks, we need to end it here. Frank and Jim, thanks for doing this. This was great. Look, I agree. This is the work of generations. This is really important work. The future of development and the future of our security is linked to the fates of fragile and conflict affected states. This matters to us. It's in our enlightened self-interest to help these countries. Sometimes these are sometimes hard to find on a map. But if you think about 9/11 and Afghanistan, or you think about the threat of pandemics, such as what happened with Ebola, which was stopped, but COVID, which was not, that pandemics are sourced oftentimes and certainly accelerated in fragile and conflict affected states. Migration, terrorist groups, gangs. If we can manage these things and get ahead of them on the prevention side, as Frank was talking about earlier, but this is bigger than the United States. It's bigger than the World Bank. It's bigger than the United Nations, bigger than military. This requires a multi-sector response, and it takes a very, very, very long time, very complicated, very challenging, but necessary. This is where the future of global development is going to be, is in these places. So this is where we're going to have to put a lot of our effort over the next 25 years. Frank, thanks so much. Jim, thanks so much. Really appreciate this. This is great. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, everybody.